welcome everyone joining us from afar. And it's a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Robtel Neajai Pailey, whose scholarship, activist commitments, writing, and generous, thoughtful, and compassionate engagement with so many people from all walks of life is greatly appreciated, admired, and inspiring. Robtel completed her BA degrees in African Studies and English Literature at Howard University, an MSc in African Studies at the University of Oxford, and a doctorate in Development Studies at SOAS, University of London, as a Mo Ibrahim Foundation PhD scholar. She has worked across a broad range of fields, supporting universities, governments, media institutions, and multilateral, regional, non-governmental, and community-based organizations, including serving as a speechwriter for former Liberian President, Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Currently, she is assistant professor in international social and public policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And her many awards and recognitions include finalists for the 2019 Mary Chirwa Award for Courageous Leadership, the 2016 finalist for Women for Africa International African Woman of the Year, and one of 25 Africans to watch by the Financial Times in 2015. A Liberian scholar activist working at the intersections of critical development studies, critical African studies, and critical race studies, Robtel centers her research on how structural transformation is conceived and contested by local, national, and transnational actors from crisis-affected regions of the so-called Global South. Today, she will be speaking with us about her newest book, Development, Dual Citizenship, and Its Discontents in Africa, recently published by Cambridge University Press. And following her talk, our own Nancy Kendall, professor and chair of educational policy studies in the School of Education, has generously agreed to offer a few comments and reflections. So please join me in giving Robtel a real warm Wisconsin welcome and an African Studies welcome. So we're really grateful to have you here. Thank you, Robtel.
Thank you so much, Greg, for that incredibly generous introduction. It's such an honor and a privilege to be speaking at the Africa at Noon seminar series, which I understand from Aaliyah McCord started in 1973, which definitely preceded me. So I feel very humbled to be joining the seminar and to close it off for the 2020-2021 academic year. So I'd like to thank Greg and Aaliyah particularly because I think we started a conversation about my coming to Madison for this seminar about a year and a half ago. And although COVID has derailed our plans for me to be physically present, it's great that we're still able to do the seminar online, and I will just have to push my visit to Madison for a later date, hopefully in the not too distant future. So I'd like to thank Greg and Aaliyah for staying the course with me and ensuring that I would actually do the seminar series. I'd also like to thank Nancy Kendall for generously agreeing to serve as a discussant. I know we're all busy juggling multiple commitments and responsibilities. So for you to take time out of your schedule to read the book and to engage with it, I'm very grateful. And then last but certainly not least, the person who's done most of the heavy lifting, Diana Famakinwa, who has been such a gracious host, who's answered all of my questions so efficiently and has been incredibly, incredibly supportive throughout this whole process of organizing. So Diana, thank you so much for your heavy lifting. And I am grateful for all the time and effort you've put into organizing this seminar. So I'm gonna put all of my gushing to the side and actually engage in a conversation about the book. And before doing that, I'm gonna share my screen so you can actually see my slides. Okay, so in terms of the presentation, I have divided my talk into about 3 parts. The first part is focusing on the contributions, the general contributions that I think I make with the book. And this is theoretical contributions, it's empirical contributions, as well as methodological contributions to the study of Africa, to the study of development, and to the study of citizenship studies in general. I also want to switch gears to part 2 and to focus on what the implications of my findings are for policymaking and practice, not only in Liberia, which is the focus of the book, but also the continent of Africa, which I engage with processes of political, economic, and social change in the continent of Africa. And then in part 3, I want to talk very briefly about why I've decided to embark on a launch tour of the book in 2021 that has taken me to 3 continents, 5 cities, and 5 countries where I actually conducted interviews, which I think is really important to think about. How do we take our research and scholarship back to the places in which we do the research and in which we do conduct interviews and qualitative studies? So in terms of my contributions, the first is the case study of Liberia itself is incredibly unique. And for those of you who are not familiar with Liberia, Liberia was actually the first Black African republic. And as a result, it was the first country in the continent of Africa to actually devise legal norms and practices around citizenship, membership, and belonging. And so what I do is, in this book, this is the first study that actually investigates both domestic as well as diasporic constructions and practices of Liberian citizenship across space and time, and their myriad implications for development, which is broadly defined as broader processes of political, economic, and social change. And I do this investigative work by using a contested dual citizenship bill that was introduced in Liberia in 2008 and actually lingered in legislative limbo for about 10 years until 2018. The bill was never passed, to ask broader questions about what does it mean to be a citizen in a post-war country, and how do you practice that citizenship domestically as well as transnationally. So what are my major arguments? There are 3 major arguments that I put forward. The first is that while mid-19th century to mid-20th century Liberian citizenship was largely passive and constructed from above by a hegemonic state, mid-20th century Liberian citizenship onwards has actually been active and reconstructed from below by citizens themselves through processes of protest. And this has happened through historical and contemporary processes and factors such as conflict, migration, and post-war recovery. So these are 3 thematic areas that I look at in the book, which I've devoted a chapter to each. Now, in the process of migration, what's interesting is that in the mid-19th century, when Liberia was established as Africa's first Black republic, citizenship was largely biased against what I call the rooted indigene. So effectively, those indigenous populations that occupied the territory that is modern-day Liberia before Black settlers came from places like the United States, the Congo River Basin, and the Caribbean. So effectively, these Black migrant settlers set up what I call citizenship tiers, and they barred from citizenship indigenous populations that lived on the coast, but also in the hinterland for the first 100 years of the Republic's establishment. On the other hand, in the 21st century, Liberian citizenship is largely biased against what I call the rootless immigrant. So effectively, those Liberians who left before, during, or after our protracted armed conflict and may have naturalized abroad, as well as those Liberians of Liberian ancestry who were born abroad to Liberian citizen fathers, are barred from citizenship because Liberia does not recognize dual citizenship. Now, this is largely predictable because scholars like Mamum Mamdani, as well as Brown and Manby, have argued that citizenship is viscerally contested in African countries that have had the greatest colonial era migration. And although Liberia was not colonized by European powers, it certainly experienced heightened levels of colonial era migration of these different migrant groups coming from, Black migrant groups coming from the Caribbean, the Congo River Basin, as well as the United States. The second argument that I make is that the 21st century gridlock or impasse on dual citizenship is really emblematic of the sort of long historical enduring struggles over Liberian citizenship across space and time. Now, Liberia is one of only 7 countries in the continent of Africa that currently prohibits dual citizenship. As a caveat, it does recognize conditional dual citizenship for Liberians of Liberian ancestry who were born abroad to Liberian citizen fathers. However, they must declare at the age of majority, effectively the age of 23, whether they want to maintain their Liberian citizenship by ancestry or their foreign citizenship by birth. The other 6 countries in Africa that prohibit dual citizenship are Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. The third argument that I make is that domestic as well as diasporic Liberian actors actually interpret citizenship quite differently, citizenship and dual citizenship quite differently, based on what Norman Long, the development sociologist, calls their life worlds, which is a really fancy way of saying their lived experiences, and their social locations, so their socioeconomic positions. So what I discovered in my research is that while some domestic Liberians think of dual citizenship as a zero-sum game, as infringing upon their already very limited access to political, economic, and social rights, as reproducing inequalities, some diasporic Liberians who live in places as far-flung as the United States, the United Kingdom, but then also within the sub-regions such as Sierra Leone and Ghana, actually believe that dual citizenship will enable development, that it will strengthen their political, economic, and social ties to the country and enable them to be stronger political, economic, and social actors. So what I do throughout the book is I actually provide a very critical frame of citizenship as both a continuum of inclusion as well as exclusion, because we all know that when you define who a citizen is, you also define who a citizen is not, right? I also provide a critical framing of development, right? As a process of both amelioration, betterment, progress, as well as degeneration, because development looks differently in terms of the prism from one end of the spectrum to another. The other thing I do is I interrogate the sort of presumed symbiotic relationship between development and dual citizenship. And this presumed symbiotic relationship is often unsubstantiated in both policy speak as well as development speak. What I show is that dual citizenship is actually viscerally contested as a development intervention. It's not a taken for granted process of amelioration, but it's also a process of degeneration depending on who you happen to be speaking to. So I present the different critiques of dual citizenship. So many scholars will argue that dual citizenship is effectively just about extending rights without necessarily extracting responsibilities, that there's nothing really required of dual citizens. Other scholars have argued that there's actually no real correlation or causation between dual citizenship enactment and increased economic contributions by nationals abroad. In this book, what I try to do, because I think quite often in the literature, there's a tendency to center the perspectives of diasporic actors. What I do is actually center the perspective of domestic citizen practices. And I say that this is the key to socioeconomic change, not necessarily diasporic practices or transnational actors and their practices. So in doing this, I challenge the literature that tends to privilege the citizenship claims, as well as even the development claims of immigrant actors. The book also offers a post-colonial critique of the sort of neoliberal framing of diasporas and donors as the panacea to post-war reconstruction. What I show in the book is that diaspora citizenship as well as domestic development claims are very, very contested in the same way that donors' development claims are contested in Liberia, in parts of West Africa, in the continent of Africa, as well as further afield. I also show that diasporas are both development enablers, but they're also development spoilers. In fact, there's a chapter in the book entitled The Dichotomy of Diasporic Developmentalism, in which I demonstrate how diasporas remittance practices, for instance, really help augment the practices at the household level. But on the other hand, diasporas, particularly in Liberia, have been very involved in corrupt forms of post-war profiteering. So they're both enablers as well as spoilers, which is why you have this sort of gridlock on dual citizenship in Liberia. The third thing I show is that diasporas are a silver lining, but they are definitely not a silver bullet when we think about post-war reconstruction processes. So what are my theoretical contributions? What I do is I employ and I expand Norman Long's notion of actor-oriented analysis. And what Norman Long argues, and he's the development sociologist that I mentioned previously, what Norman Long argues is that different actors respond to development interventions quite differently, again, based on their social locations as well as their life worlds. And it's not enough to assume that those who might be in subordinate positions would be marginalized at what he calls the interface. He says that there are actually negotiations over development interventions at the interface, in which there might be processes of divergence, where the different actors, there's confrontation or conflict amongst the different actors, or there might be convergence at the interface, in which there's accommodation or agreement, and the different actors learn to overcome their differences in terms of their social locations or their life worlds. But what I do is I further the interface, the notion of the interface, by moving beyond the sort of localized, sort of bounded encounters over actual development projects, to think about the interface as a process of thinking around transnational or sort of an ideological exchange about the pros as well as the cons of dual citizenship as a proposed policy-oriented development intervention. In the book, I also come up with what I call a Liberian citizenship triad. So I theorize citizenship as a triad, primarily because scholars like Lisa Malky, the social anthropologist, show that identities, practices, and relations between people actually really transform in the aftermath of violent conflict, as Liberia experienced. So what I show is Liberia's contested state formation processes that started in the early 1800s, and then continued on to the political upheavals of the 1980s, and the protracted armed conflict of 1989 to 2003 has developed this sort of Liberian citizenship triad. So there are three nodes of the triad. It's like a triangle. On one node of the triad is citizenship as identity. And this is largely a very passive way of thinking about citizenship. There's nothing actually required, right? You're born into a particular citizenship, or maybe you have ancestry that enables you to be a citizen of a particular locale, but you actually don't do anything that garners this particular citizenship. On one end of the citizenship triad is the practice of citizenship, and this is largely an active form of citizenship. So this can be everything from paying property taxes to voting in national elections to developing local capacities. That's a form of citizenship. So it's what you do with that identity that makes you a citizen, right? In fact, one of my respondents argued that it's what you contribute in terms of your time, your talent, and your treasure is what makes you a Liberian, not the kind of passport you wield around, because he argued they're all blue nowadays. On another end of the citizenship triad is citizenship as a set of relationships. And this is an interactive form of citizenship in which the relationships between citizen and citizen are just as important as the relationship between citizen and government or citizen and state. I also theorize citizenship as what I call a political economy of belonging. So moving beyond the politics of belonging, think about the political economy of belonging. And this is what I mean by, what I mean by this is that socio-economic transformation, so development writ large, really depends on not only the provision of privileges and protections, what we might think about as rights, but also in exchange for the fulfillment of duties and obligations, what we might think about as responsibilities. What I argue is that quite often in the literature on dual citizenship, it's too often the emphasis is placed on the provision of privileges and protections, rights, and not sufficiently on that exchange with the fulfillment of duties and obligations, responsibilities. And lastly, I theorize citizenship from the perspective of a post-war African country of emigration, right? I expand the contours of the general citizenship studies literature, which I believe tends to be quite Eurocentric and abstract. So the intention of this is to make this study an Afrocentric study that is incredibly empirically grounded and concrete in its orientation. So what are my methodological as well as empirical contributions? Well, what I do is I conduct multi-sided field work. This book is based on over 200 in-depth interviews that I did in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, the UK, the US, primarily with Liberian actors. I did interview 7 Sierra Leonean policymakers, but they are not the focus of the study. So there's semi-structured interviews conducted in these 5 countries, 5 cities, 3 continents. And it's basically a response to Saskia Saskin's work. And she argues that global cities are the sites where citizenship is most viscerally contested. And beyond global cities, capital cities are the sites in which citizenship is most viscerally contested. So I really wanted to test this hypothesis by looking at the capitals of Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, the UK, and the US. What I do is I offer extensive comparative analysis between what I call homelanders. So these are Liberians who maintain residence in Liberia, may have left for very short periods of time before, during, or after the war, but actually consider Liberia the only home they've ever had. I compare their perspectives and experiences with those who have returned to the country or returned to the country after the first or second post-war moment. And these are circular returnees as well as permanent returnees. I also compare and contrast the perspectives and experiences of both executive as well as legislative policymakers. So I interview the 4 sponsors of the dual citizenship bill to kind of understand what the motivations were for pushing this particular policy prescription forward and what kinds of challenges they may have faced throughout the process of that 10-year suspension. Last but certainly not least, I also compare and contrast the perspectives of what Nicholas Van Heer calls, my former colleague from Oxford, calls the near diaspora versus the wider diaspora. So for instance, those Liberians who happen to reside in Sierra Leone and Ghana would be considered the near diaspora, and those who move further afield to places like the United Kingdom and the United States would be considered wider diasporas. And I did this deliberately and intentionally because the literature on diasporas tends to focus almost exclusively on wider diasporas, when in actuality, the vast majority of migrants who leave their countries of origin settle in the regions of origin. They don't go to the so-called global north, particularly those migrants from the so-called global south actually stay in their regions of origin. The third thing that I do is I employ vignettes and verbatim quotes generously from fieldwork. My pages are littered with quotes from interviews that I've conducted, quite extensive block quotes, because I really wanted to demonstrate how people were thinking about citizenship, how people were conceptualizing citizenship, how people were contesting citizenship and the notions therein in their own words. It was really, really important for me to document people's experiences and their perspectives in their own words. So you see the breakdown of the table in the 202 Liberian respondents in the urban centers. So the diaspora breakdown, the homelanders breakdown, the policy makers, as well as the returnees, and then the total. One of the other things that I do is I think I'm making a contribution to the scholarly canon about Liberia by Liberians. So I engage extensively with the work of Liberian scholars. I even consider myself something of a conversation facilitator amongst these scholars, and I put them in conversation with one another in something of a dialogue. And this is largely in response to what I've seen as the erasure, whether deliberate or non-deliberate, the erasure within the mainstream literature in Liberian studies as well as in African studies, where these scholars are not centered. Their perspectives and the large body of scholarship that they've developed and produced is not even cited or referenced. And I consider this to be a form of epistemic violence. So I intentionally engage with these Liberian scholars, putting them in conversation with one another. And these are scholars who have left us. So people like Clarence E. Zamba Liberty, people like Thomas J. May their souls rest in perfect peace and power. And then also those who are still alive and kicking. Those people like George Clay Kia Jr., people like Carl Patrick Burroughs, D. Elwood Dunn, Joseph Sequanu, Augustine Kane, some of whose books are pictured on the bottom of this particular slide. Now I'll switch gears a bit to talk about what the implications of my findings might be for policymaking as well as practice, both in Liberia as well as the continent writ large. Now this table was generated from the interviews that I conducted with 202 Liberian respondents in the 5 fieldwork locations. And what I've done is I've highlighted the percentage of Liberians in green who actually support dual citizenship in principle. Many of these interviewees argue that dual citizenship does have a significant impact on development. It does enable development, it does enhance development. And that Liberians who may have naturalized abroad should not be penalized for leaving through no fault of their own. So about 61% of my respondents actually argued that dual citizenship will help with strengthening social cohesion. It will help with different broader processes of political, economic, and social change, bringing about broader processes of political, economic, and social change. What I've highlighted in red is those who rejected dual citizenship. Now, I'll say as a caveat that I make it very clear throughout the book that my small respondent pool of 202 Liberians is certainly not representative of Liberians worldwide. The book was largely intended to be exploratory and not necessarily representative. And so it does demonstrate certain trends, but it certainly isn't representative. What's interesting is that those Liberians who rejected dual citizenship were about 18%, but the vast majority of those who rejected dual citizenship were those who were based in Monrovia. And it goes back to this whole idea of capital cities being the sites in which citizenship is viscerally contested. So homelanders, those Liberians, again, who had lived in the country for most of their lives, maybe have spent short periods of time abroad, but have considered Liberia their only home, were the ones who were the most viscerally contesting of dual citizenship. Now, what's interesting is that these findings are actually corroborated by Afrobarometer survey data. For those of you who are not familiar with Afrobarometer, it's a Pan-African survey that actually looks at political trends in the continent of Africa. What's interesting is that Afrobarometer survey was conducted in Liberia in 2012 as well as in 2018. And the results were that the vast majority of those who were surveyed, about 2/3, actually rejected dual citizenship outright. And so when I looked at my own findings, I realized that the Afrobarometer data actually corroborates these findings about people feeling a sense of serious grievance around dual citizenship, particularly those who live and reside in the country. Now, what's interesting is that Liberia actually had a national referendum in December 2020, in which dual citizenship was one of 8 propositions. Now, the dual citizenship bill, as well as all the other propositions, did not garner the required 2/3 majority vote in order to push forward as a policy prescription being enacted into law. But what's interesting is that the vast majority of valid ballots that were counted during the national referendum demonstrated that slightly more Liberians approve of dual citizenship in principle than those who reject dual citizenship. And so this is it's demonstrated in the continental trends that we've seen. Only 7 countries in the continent of Africa, including Liberia, actually prohibit dual citizenship nowadays, whereas most countries in the continent of Africa enacted dual citizenship about between 1970 and now. So in Montserrado, which is one of the 15 subpolitical divisions in Liberia, which is where the capital city Liberia lies, is where you find almost an even split between those who supported dual citizenship amongst the valid ballots and those who rejected dual citizenship. So about 96,356 Liberians in Montserrado County, where the capital lies, approved of dual citizenship. Of course, about 97,000 plus rejected dual citizenship. So again, not the 2/3 majority vote required to push the policy prescription forward. But what I see throughout this particular finding is that while Afrobarometer data demonstrated in 2012 and 2018 that 2/3 of Liberians rejected dual citizenship, I would say that Liberia is moving more and more closer to accepting dual citizenship. It will take some time, but I believe that it is inevitable that Liberia will enact dual citizenship, given the trends in the national referendum results, as well as in the public discourse and the policymaking around why it's important to think about this as a development-oriented policy prescription. Now, while I say that Liberia will inevitably enact dual citizenship, the country definitely must take a gradual, phased approach, given that there's still misgivings on the ground amongst domestic citizens about the fact that dual citizenship might reproduce inequalities in the country. And so what I proffer in terms of policy recommendations are a few things. The first is that Liberia has to think about how do we reconcile the contradictions between the 1973 Aliens and Nationality Law, which strictly prohibits dual citizenship, and the 1986 Constitution, which is more permissive of dual citizenship, kind of implicitly. We also have to think about how do we reform the judiciary such that people are not flouting Liberian laws that currently exist on the books. And then lastly, we have to think about how do we address the inequalities that are so germane to the contestations around dual citizenship. So inequalities around income, given that in the post-war moment, many Liberians who came back were paid significantly more than those who had already lived in the country. Inequalities around land access. So those coming back now reclaiming land that has been significantly used by squatters who stayed in the capital Monrovia during the course of the war. Inequalities around transitional justice. During the war, there were a number of Liberians abroad who were accused and found guilty of stoking armed conflict, right? Supporting rebel factions in the country and being able to do so from the comfort of their homes in the United States, for instance. So Liberia is, a number of activist communities are pushing for war and economics crimes court in Liberia, in which a number of diasporic Liberians are implicated in the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports. So what Liberia effectively has to think about is how do you extend rights to would-be dual citizens while also extracting responsibilities? There are a number of examples from the continent of Africa that we could think about in terms of policy good practices. So for instance, Eritrea charges a 2% diaspora tax that is supposed to be used for reconstruction efforts in the country. Senegal allows for diasporas to vote in a diaspora representative in the national legislature. Perhaps Liberia could think about that in lieu of enabling diasporas to vote directly for the House of Representatives as well as the Senate. Sierra Leone has also established an operational office of diaspora affairs in the presidency. Now, when I lived and worked in Liberia for Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, this is one of the things that I was trying to push forward, is to establish an office of diaspora affairs in the presidency such that the concerns of those living abroad could be reconciled by the nation state. Ethiopia also allows non-citizen diasporas to invest, to own shares, as well as to set up lending businesses. And then last but certainly not least, thinking about the fact that Liberia has large, vast amounts of land that lay fallow for a number of years, not being used for any reconstruction processes, perhaps granting the right to purchase land, rural land, in exchange for agricultural production could be a happy medium, while extending rights and extracting responsibilities from would-be dual citizens. Now I'm going to switch gears and just talk very briefly about the launch tour that I've embarked on this year. So the book was launched initially in Liberia in January, on publication day on January 7th. And it was very important for me to take the book back to Liberia, take the book back to the respondents who were so important and instrumental in me generating these findings. So launching the book in Liberia, first and foremost, was intentional because the book is about Liberia, it's by a Liberian, and it's about Liberia. In February, I also launched the book in London at the London School of Economics. There was a launch last week in Washington, DC at Howard University, my undergraduate alma mater. And then I will close the launch tour series with a launch in Accra, Ghana at the University of Ghana, and in September in Freetown, Sierra Leone at the University of Sierra Leone. If you want more information about the remaining launches, you can find that on my personal website, robtelneajaipailey.com. But the rationale for doing this launch tour, I would say, is that quite often, much of the research about Africa and or development in Africa tends to be incredibly extractive and exploitative. It doesn't really serve the continent or its people. Right? It serves other purposes other than the continent and its people. And so I really wanted my research to be emancipatory and transformative, not only in terms of the public discourse, but also in terms of the policymaking processes in the continent, in Liberia, and perhaps even writ large. So I will end there and say thank you so much for your attention. I know the questions and comments are going to follow Nancy's presentation.
Robtel, thank you so much. So I I get the chance to speak about this book briefly and to ask Robtel some questions. I'm going to try to keep it short since I know we don't have that much time for what I'm sure are going to be lots of other questions. But I wanted to start by just saying how much I really deeply appreciated this work and reading the book. It's a real joy to read. So I hope that everyone does so. I approached this book really thinking about it from the perspective of the international development hat that I wear, although there's a lot of really interesting themes that you raise about education and how to think about the translation of educational certification across spaces and the ways that development and international regimes do that to really create very significant problems. The book, and Robtel said this really briefly, but it's just very full of very rich data. And I really appreciated the fact that although the theorizing is phenomenal, it is not disconnected from the people who you spoke with. It's very clear how you're weaving together the narratives that you heard. And that's rare, honestly. Very often you just don't have the chance to hear people in that way. I wanted to also just say how much I appreciated this work as an example of a study of a new theme in critical development studies more broadly, which is kind of the study of policies that die or go very limp and kind of stay kind of half alive for a decade, or that flip, where one thing has happened and suddenly the next year the exact opposite occurs, and using these as pivots for really trying to dive into the question of how do we make deeper sense of both the logics and the material realities that are shaping people's engagement with development, however that may be defined. And I appreciated in particular the fact that you decentered focus on purely largely internationally driven policies, like all of the great work on structural adjustment, which was phenomenal, but really didn't help us dive into this question of citizen-citizen and citizen-state relations in the exact same way. So all of that I just think is a great contribution to the critical development studies literature more broadly. You bring together a range of voices, and you've laid out for us who they are and why you chose them, as well as literatures that are rarely examined together. And I appreciated the way that that helped reposition this notion, the kind of developmentalist logic of external salvation, which is so clear in some of the discourses of dual citizenship, but that you really helped to position both historically and currently in a lovely way. You offer the alternative argument that fierce nationalism against a common enemy, which, for example, Ebola was briefly, as a potentially best alternative development path forward. And I wanted to ask you, one of my questions for you is if you could talk a little bit more about that, because on the one hand, it makes a tremendous amount of sense given everything that you lay out for us. And on the other hand, your book is also fully at every stage about entanglements that deeply complicate that as a model, if not making it impossible, if for no other reason than thinking about the relationship between Liberia, Sierra Leone, and kind of statist formations that call to people in different ways. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the idea of rights, responsibilities, and relations in relation to development across these actors and levels. From your perspective, what should those look like ideally, given entanglements? What would fierce nationalism look like within that broader set of entanglements? And then in terms of your discussion of citizenship, I was struck at various points in the book about the fact that the model of kind of active citizenship called to mind very particular constructions of governmentality. So for example, good citizens have the right heart, and what that looks like and what it means in practice, not only in terms of thinking about it as requiring action, but also thinking about the logic driving that particular notion of good citizen. And while your interviews are very far from kind of post-structuralist in their approach to making sense of this, it's also clear that aspects of neoliberal logics could become embedded in notions of citizenship in ways that would further complicate the effort to, for example, not have income inequalities drive different modes of citizenship or abilities of people to participate in development. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the potential. You talked about the triangle of rights, responsibilities, and relations. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more. The book mostly focuses on rights and responsibilities and the deep tensions that exist there. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the triangle, and from your perspective, what an ideal citizenship model would look like and why. And I will stop and just say again, how incredibly thankful I am to you for this work and how much I look forward to using it and to bothering you with more questions in the future.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for the questions. And we were saying this before we actually started the webinar, but anyone who's ever written a book, it's sort of your baby. You nurture this thing, especially if it's coming out of the PhD for long periods of time. And then you just kind of put it out into the universe, and you're not really sure the kind of reception you'll get, or whether people will appreciate it in the way that you have, because you've nursed it and nurtured it. So to hear a senior scholar praise the book and to say how much she appreciated, it means so much to me. And it's incredibly affirming that I must have done something right. So thank you so much for that, Nancy. So in terms of your question, it's interesting because quite often when we're thinking about the continent of Africa, the idea of nationalism is in some respects looked at in a negative light, right? That nationalism bore certain levels of inequality post-independence in certain parts of the continent of Africa. That nationalism created these tiers of difference. That nationalism created different levels of almost kind of reproducing the colonial encounter by giving certain national elites power over those who were so-called governed. But I actually kind of flipped the script in the book kind of deliberately to think about, well, what about those states that were created, states like Israel or states like Liberia that were created with the sole purpose by external actors? So for instance, I always say, in jest, that Liberia was effectively created by an NGO, the American Colonization Society, that pseudo, white abolitionists in the United States decided we want to make sure that these people leave, these free blacks leave the country because they could create havoc for Southern plantations in which enslaved people would see these free people and say, wait a second, we want to be free too. But then, so for instance, Liberia didn't really have a nationalist movement in which the colonial power was the external enemy. So what happens to a country that has not undergone a sort of fierce nationalist struggle? And so as Nancy mentioned, at the end of the book, what I talk about is the Ebola experience as being our, whether it's very short-lived, as being our fierce nationalist encounter in which the common enemy was Ebola, it wasn't each other. Because our whole history has been about contestation amongst the so-called indigents versus the so-called settlers. And so when I think about that very short period of the Ebola outbreak in which we were fighting a common enemy outside of ourselves, and we were really rallying around together. So diasporic Liberians were sending support. Domestic Liberians were using their resources and their talents and their treasure to ensure that we would tackle this common enemy, and that it wouldn't completely consume us as a nation. That's where I saw that triangle really manifest itself. That idea of the identity having a conversation with the practice, having a conversation with a set of relationships. And I haven't seen that post-Ebola. It's almost like we reverted back to the pre-Ebola experience in which we were each other's common enemies. And so what I want to do is do a bit more digging on that particular encounter, interviewing people about that experience of 2016, 2018, and perhaps that being a new project in the future about Ebola being the site in which the triangle actually makes sense and is actually concretely experienced as well as theorized. So you really do see the rights, people saying, well, wait a second, we should have had a stronger health system. Why is it that our health system that's crumbling because of, neoliberal policies that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf administration adopted? We don't even have gloves, and we are one of the largest producers of latex. We don't even have enough gloves in the hospitals. The responsibilities around the state having a responsibility to domestic citizens, but then also domestic citizens having a responsibility to each other, right? Protecting the other from contagion. And then the relationships, we see the relationships playing out across the board, transnationally as well as domestically, between citizens and citizens themselves, and between citizens and state. So I think for me, that was the real defining moment, and which is the reason I decided to close with that particular chapter, to talk about perhaps nationalism isn't necessarily dead, and perhaps states like Liberia need to go through the iterations of a nationalist project in order to think about what it means to be a citizen in the 21st century, and to concretize that nation state, because I think Liberia's been a state, but it hasn't been a nation. And it was the Ebola experience that enabled us to create the seeds of what a nation could look like. In terms of and then I think that also brings me to the second question you had about what the ideal triad would look like, and how would it manifest itself in terms of reality. I think one of the things that I struggled with writing the book is I really wanted to push back against this notion that diasporas are the saviors of the domestic, and diasporas should be at the pinnacle of pushing for development, pushing for socio-economic transformation, while almost negating the contributions of those who are on the ground. And that tension being very, very tightened as a result of a nation, a state that values the contributions of those coming from abroad, and almost negates the contributions of those who are already in the nation state. So I would say that the government, the nation, kind of recognizing that all those talents are valuable across the spectrum, and working to enhance those talents and those skills, and valuing those talents and those skills, for me would be the ultimate manifestation of the triad, right? So the state saying, or the government saying, domestic citizens are just as important in terms of socioeconomic transformation as those who are abroad. But then also recognizing that within the population of domestic citizens, and within the population of diasporic citizens, there are also spoilers, right? So a lot of people, in fact, a lot of Liberians abroad will say to me, well, why do you always criticize us? There are Liberians in the country who don't pay their property taxes. So why should we be required to pay property taxes or a diasporic tax, and those who are in the country don't? So again, the idea of this being all hands on deck, and all of us having a responsibility to lift up the nation state, because at the end of the day, that exchange, right, that whole idea of the political economy of belonging, the provision of privileges and protections, also has to be in exchange for the fulfillment of duties and responsibilities. And those duties and responsibilities are both of domestic citizens as well as diasporic citizens. So I think ultimately what I'm trying to do through that configuration of the political economy of belonging is to say that's where the triangle makes the most sense. And that's what we should be pushing for, that exchange between rights and responsibilities. And not just about the rights, or not just about the responsibilities, but both simultaneously working in tandem together.
So thank you so much, Robtel, for that really wonderful overview of the book, and in such a succinct way and timely. Everyone was so timely, and Nancy for starting the conversation with your really thoughtful comments. I just want to remind people that you can post questions in the Q&A box, or also raise your hand, and I can allow you to speak. We have, let's see here, Jacqueline, please, you should be able to speak now.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for this really fascinating talk. And my question is really out of curiosity. When you were mentioning your categorizations for the diaspora. You talked about the near diaspora and the wider diasporas, with, it seems like a focus more on beyond the continent. And I was just really curious to know, is there room to include those who have moved within the continent in your definition of the wider diaspora? So those who are moving to other African countries, just very curious.
So the way, thank you for your question, Jacqueline. So the way that Nicholas Van Heer theorizes it, and I follow his theorization, is that he considers the near diaspora to be those migrants or those diasporas who move to a country within the subregion of origin. So for instance, within the case of the Liberia case study would be Liberians in Sierra Leone that I interviewed and Liberians in Ghana who are in the economic community of West African states within the subregion. And then he theorizes those wider diasporas as those who left the subregion. So we would even perhaps even consider wider diasporas to be Liberians who lived in South Africa. So outside of the economic community of West African states would be the wider diasporas in the continent of Africa, but then also those who live outside of the continent of Africa.
Okay, thank you so much.
No problem.
Other questions? Well, I'll ask one on many and really eager to read the book. But one question I have, I know you focused, on Monrovia and kind of urban centers and you showed the referendum in terms of Montserrado County. I'm wondering what your intuition is, or even just on the ground from what that looks like in rural counties, and particularly the ways in which, if at all, the dual citizenship discussions in Liberia have also got entangled up in land rights discussions, which have been so active in the passage of the Land Rights Act in 2018, which is really driven, from my understanding, a lot in rural counties and a lot particularly among women in Liberia. So how do those intersect at all?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The land one is, I devote a whole chapter to the question of land, because for people who are not familiar with Liberian laws, only citizens can own land. So people always ask me, well, what's at stake? Land ownership is at stake. I mean, it's one of the major issues at stake in terms of citizenship. So lots of Liberians, many Liberians who left during, before, after the war, naturalized abroad, technically, legally, do not have any claims to land that they may have owned before they naturalized. And that's a big issue for a lot of Liberians who live abroad, that connection to the land, that connection to be rooted, physically as well as metaphysically rooted, is embedded in land ownership. Your question about what would happen in terms of these contestations in rural areas is spot on. So I say in the book that my book is very urban biased. So perhaps a subsequent study would be doing interviews in Nimba County. So what's interesting is that I showed the referendum results from Montserrado, but if you look at the referendum results in Nimba County, there also is visceral contestation around dual citizenship. In fact, it's not even an even split between the yes and the no vote. The no votes overrule the yes vote. And that's only in Nimba and Montserrado, the only spaces where the contestation is viscerally seen, but Nimba more so than Montserrado. In fact, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was more than 2/3 majority vote against dual citizenship in Nimba County. So there's something happening in Nimba that I'm not really sure I can't put my finger on, because I didn't do interviews in Nimba County. So, but for me, that's a really interesting finding that I need to sort of investigate, because people in rural areas perhaps may have very different interpretations of what citizenship means and their practice therein than those who exist in the urban centers like Monrovia. Yes, but yes, the land issue is part and parcel of this discussion. And as you mentioned, the Land Rights Act in 2018, when I give the proposal about the possibility of diasporas or would-be diaspora or dual citizens owning agricultural land. There's often contestation around that because there's been so much land grabbing in Liberia in the past, 10, 15, 20 years, where these big agro-industrial ventures by multinationals are being taken up through oil palm production. And so the question is, well, how will you protect rural citizens or rural dwellers from that kind of land grab by diasporas or would-be dual citizens? What kinds of enforcement would we look to the Land Rights Act, or will we have to create another mechanism to ensure that there isn't land grabbing by would-be dual citizens too?
Great. So we have another question. This one is from Elaine Tumble. She says, thank you so much. Questions about the triad. Do you think there is a variation in how the different elements of the triad are more pronounced, prominent than others? Theoretically, we tend to think it's all about rights and sometimes responsibilities, when in reality, relationships might be more important. In some contexts, you might have empirical citizenship be more about how people relate to each other and other forms of public authority, which is sometimes not the state. And do you have any hunch as to what might be driving this kind of variation across countries? Thank you so much, Erin.
Wow, that's a really, really big question. What's interesting is I think the book, maybe as a limitation, the book does focus too much on the rights and responsibilities equation and not enough of an investigation of the relationships and those interactive forms of citizenship. I mean, the person kind of alluded to this, but I think another limitation of the book is that I focus quite often on the Westphalian notion of a citizen, right? Like what did citizenship look like, or what were notions of belonging pre-settler independence? Is a question but I'm not a historian. I'm kind of a pseudo-historian. So I've passed the baton on to, historians of Liberia to investigate and dig up on what did the political economy of belonging look like before 1847. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a question that I'm still kind of grappling with myself in terms of that relationships, but you're absolutely right. Relationships, particularly in settings in which there's limited statehood, in which people don't have a relationship to the state, but they do have a relationship to their kinfolk. They do have a relationship to their ethnic groups. They do have a relationship to other forms that are subnational, that are sometimes more important in terms of how they relate to one another and how they practice citizenship than to the nation state.
I know we're at time, but for those of you that can stay, we have one more question, and I'd like to take the liberty to ask it. The question was, how did the COVID crisis, or does the COVID crisis even influence nationalist tendencies among Liberians? Did it have a similar effect as the Ebola crisis? Which is, I think, is a really interesting question, because it's also, we see a lot of kind of decolonial narratives coming out of Africa now in response to COVID, and the geopolitics being so different, where, Ebola was really centered in, the West African nations of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. And yet now Africa as a continent is one of the least affected countries in terms of the COVID crisis, and is really, I think, inspiring an interesting solidarity, among African nations in interesting ways. So I really look forward to your thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I didn't have a chance to ask very much about COVID when I was there. I sort of just parachuted in, did my launch, said hello, kids, loved ones, and then I came back to the UK. But I am going back to Liberia, and I'll be in Sierra Leone for the duration of the summer. So it's something that it's sort of in the back of my mind about asking questions about. But what I did see, just very superficially, is people were like, COVID? What's that? I mean, if you compare it to the sheer horror and terror of Ebola, I was there for, I think, 3 or 4 months in 2014, in which that was the epicenter of the crisis, and the heightened moments when the infection rates were they skyrocketed. And there's even a line in the very beginning of the book in the conclusion where I'm sitting on my porch with my aunt and she's saying, we dodged bullets during the war. Now Ebola is going to come and kill us. That sort of anxiety and terror I didn't experience in Liberia when I was there in January of this year at all. I mean, the numbers coming out of Liberia, and people have said perhaps the numbers are underreported, but the sheer, the Ebola is nothing to compare. Coronavirus is nothing to compare the experience of Ebola. I think we had about 1,000 cases when I was there in Monrovia, and maybe 20 or 30 deaths. Could be underreported, but the kind of fear that people had, you could smell it, you could taste it, you could feel it in 2014 and 2015. It's not like that at all in Liberia now. So I'm not sure that it's had as significant an impact on notions and constructions of citizenship and practices of citizenship as Ebola did.
Wonderful. Well, we're past time, so I just want to thank you again, Robtel, for this opportunity to hear your work. Really excited to, I know many of us will be buying the book, and thank you, Nancy, for engaging with it as well. And really look forward to a time when we can invite you back to Madison properly, and share a meal and more conversations together. So, and thank you all for joining us, and thanks to Diana for really making this all possible in terms of all the technical behind the scene things. So I hope everyone has a great rest of the day, and really appreciated their time. So thank you.